Welcome to our explainer video on the complex and uncertain situation in Syria. For over a decade, Syria has been ravaged by civil war, a conflict so brutal and convoluted it would make even George R.R. Martin say, okay, maybe we need to dial back the bloodshed a bit. Today we'll explore 5 potential scenarios for the future of Syria. From the grim prospect of continued Assad rule to the equally grim prospect of renewed conflict, we'll unpack the challenges and implications of each possibility. So buckle up, because we're about to dive headfirst into a geopolitical quagmire. The first scenario we'll examine is, unfortunately, the most likely in the short term. Bashar al-Assad remains in power. Assad has powerful allies in Russia and Iran who've been instrumental in propping up his regime. Under this scenario, we'd likely see continued repression, with Assad tightening his grip on power. Basic freedoms would be further restricted, dissent would be met with brutal force, and the Syrian people would continue to suffer under his oppressive rule. Reconstruction efforts, hampered by corruption and international sanctions, would be sluggish at best, leaving much of the country in ruins. This scenario would also likely see the continued displacement of millions of Syrians, forced to flee their homes due to violence, persecution, or simply the lack of basic necessities. These refugees would face an uncertain future, adding to the already staggering humanitarian crisis. In this scenario, things get even more complicated. Here, the balance of power between Assad, Russia, Iran, and other regional actors like Turkey and Israel shifts. New alliances could form, old rivalries could reignite, and the entire region could be thrown into further turmoil. This scenario could see increased tensions between Israel and Iran, proxy wars fought on Syrian soil, and a resurgence of extremist groups like ISIS taking advantage of the chaos. It's like trying to put out a grease fire with gasoline. You might extinguish one flame, but you're just going to create a much bigger problem in the process. This scenario offers a sliver of hope, but it's important not to get too optimistic. Here, either through internal pressure or international negotiations, a limited political transition takes place in Syria. Assad might make some concessions, allowing for limited reforms and a semblance of political participation. But let's be clear, this wouldn't be a genuine transition to democracy. While this scenario could lead to a reduction in violence and some improvements in the humanitarian situation, it's unlikely to address the root causes of the conflict. The deep-seated grievances, the lack of trust between different factions, and the culture of impunity would likely persist, leaving Syria vulnerable to future unrest. This scenario is unfortunately all too familiar. Here, the fragile peace collapses, and Syria plunges back into full-blown conflict. It could be triggered by any number of factors: a breakdown of ceasefires, an escalation of tensions between regional powers, or simply the deep-seated animosity and mistrust between different factions. This scenario would be catastrophic, leading to a resurgence of violence, mass displacement, and a humanitarian crisis of unimaginable proportions. The international community, already struggling to address the Syrian crisis, would be overwhelmed, and the Syrian people would be left to bear the brunt of the violence. It's a bleak and terrifying prospect, a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict and the fragility of peace. This final scenario is perhaps the most depressing of all. Here, Syria remains trapped in a state of perpetual instability, neither at war nor at peace. The conflict might not be as intense as in previous years, but violence would continue to flare up sporadically, fueled by local grievances, economic hardship, and the proliferation of armed groups. Reconstruction efforts would be piecemeal and inadequate, leaving much of the country in ruins. It's a bleak existence, a slow and agonizing death spiral for a country that was once full of promise. It's important to remember that the situation in Syria is highly complex and uncertain. However, by understanding the potential scenarios and the factors at play, we can better grasp the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. For further information, consult reputable news sources like BBC News, CNN, and the New York Times, as well as international organizations such as the United Nations and the International Crisis Group. Do your own research, challenge your assumptions, and stay informed about this critical issue. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more informative content.